and welcome to the Muslim Matters podcast. I am your host, Zainab bint Yunus, and our guest today is Celsabil Hadj-Cherif. Celsabil is a community organizer, activist, political analyst, and student of the Islamic sciences. Her work focuses on the history of Islamic political movement, Islamic law, and Middle Eastern politics. In keeping with the post-Mamdani flurry of discussion around Muslim political engagement, Celsabil and I are going to try and take the conversation just a little bit further. The question we want to talk about today is, what are Muslims missing in terms of political vision, and how can we or should we move forward? Sensabil, welcome to the podcast.
Salam, thank you very much for having me.
So this is a really huge question, and I actually want to start off our podcast and launch it with a quote from you that you had shared on Instagram, which I really, really liked. And you said, if not Muslim-ness, then what do we center our politics on without losing ourselves? So in light of Mamdani's, there's a lot of talk about what works for Muslims in politics and what doesn't. There's a lot of people who throw themselves into Western politics, fully buying into the entire political structure without critical thinking. They end up usually tokenized or entirely subsumed into the same toxic systems they originally claimed to be changing from within. And we see this a lot with Muslims who try to get involved in political lobbies. And in the Obama era, this was particularly terrible because later we saw them at the White House of Thoughts, and they'd be humiliated by the Israeli ambassador showing up and basically proving how useless they were and how ineffectual they were. But then on the flip side, we've also got those who declare that we should just abandon politics entirely because the whole thing is rigged, nothing is ever going to change, nothing's going to help us, what's the point? Even though one could argue that even though they think they're abandoning politics, the reality is that they're still engaging with it because they're directly impacted by it anyway, whether we're talking about surveillance, whether we're talking about just like everyday things like paying your taxes, right? That's inherently
Yeah.
political anyways. So what are your thoughts on this, and how do you think that we need to start structuring these discussions and start approaching these discussions of political engagement?
So, in terms of wins and what we project as wins, I think the first thing we need to think of is, what is Muslimness? So, what is it we're trying to preserve when we're acting, whether it's politically, socially, communally, in general? What exactly is Muslimness? Because what is happening, I think, what I've observed in the West is there's two separate things. There's being a Muslim, which is acting based on principles, acting based on scripture and an understanding of scripture. And then there is the culture that is Muslimness in general. That culture has been produced by Muslims in the West in general, but in America and Britain in particular. And it has a certain set of cultural, social, and even political norms. And those norms have created things that are, it's a sort of ideology that we've produced. And part of that is ideas around critical engagement. And like you said, a lot of it is polarized. So people exist on two sides of a political spectrum. Either we don't engage at all, we refuse to engage with politics because politics is inherently harmful and it's an unjust system and we don't want to deal with it. And for some reason, they don't realize that statement in itself was political. You're opting out of a system, but at the same time, you're not considering the implications of doing that. Or maybe you are and still choosing to. In any case, it's a political statement. And there are others who have chosen to engage with it. And it's interesting. We talk about tokenism. What do we actually mean by tokenism? Because that's participation, which is put in a manner that doesn't are being utilized by a system to essentially placate a group of people by pretending that there is someone representing them in the system when there really isn't. And they don't actually have any real material representation. And that's generally speaking what we mean when we look at these figures. And so when we want to start thinking about how to deal and to work through the political system as Muslims, we need to think about what our core values are. What is it that we're holding near and dear to us? Is it a set of principles, or is it a culture that we've reproduced? Is it just an understanding of social norms that we've normalized and political stances that we decided are unchangeable and so on? The other issue is it even useful to center Muslim identity when engaging in politics? Because if you think about it, we're a really small minority, a very small minority that doesn't amount to a critical mass. We can't really change anything through voting because we don't actually have control over enough areas. You've got first past the post systems and so on. We really don't have the numbers. We've tried. There was the Muslim vote campaign in the UK where there was some success, but it's just too small a base. Not only that, it's not a monolith. You've got class divisions, you've got race divisions within that, you've got gender divisions. A lot of this hasn't been studied, but it would be interesting to study how Muslims vote in accordance to class and in accordance to gender, and what can we build a credible center on, right, for our political vision without necessarily centering Muslimness. It's thinking about a broader spectrum of issues that we can deal with. The other issue is often our Muslimness is centered for us. And in that sense, we're being reactionary because the first thing that is noticed about you when you're a Muslim engaging in politics is the fact that you are Muslim. Shani, for example, I don't think he intended to center his Muslimness in it as much as it was centered. He is a Muslim, and that's just about it. That's as far as he's willing to go. He doesn't perform Muslimness in any manner. He just is a Muslim. But the
And he
amount
was running on the claim that he was running to represent Islam or Muslims. He was there to represent his constituency, and that includes Muslims. Like, he was very clear about acknowledging Muslims and going to masajid and so on and so forth, and he wasn't shying away from the Muslimness attributed to him. But he
yes,
certainly wasn't running on a platform, I am a Muslim and I am running according to Islamic values at all.
absolutely not. But it was centered for him. It was the thing that was drawn out mostly in the media. The level of Islamophobia in statements by the media and politicians, from putting a burqa on the Statue of Liberty as this massive threat to images of planes flying into the Twin Towers, it's massively Islamophobic. And so actually the perception of Muslims and the general perception of his Muslimness is not been shaped by him because, like you said, he wasn't running on that ticket. He wasn't running on Islamic values. He has a very clear message that centered something else entirely, mainly wealth inequality and the lack of affordability and people struggling to make ends meet day to day, people struggling to live in a city in which they serve, in which they work, in which they are necessary because they actually keep it running. It was giving them visibility and calling it their city. That was his main message. It can be appreciated, the fact that he did not deny his Muslimness, he didn't set it aside. He didn't try to label it in any way. He didn't go out of his way to call himself a liberal Muslim or any. He just embraced it and says, yes, it ends there. And so the thing is, when we choose, and we often do that, to engage on the basis of our Muslimness exclusively, we're buying into the othering that we experience, because that's what the function of Islamophobia also is. It's to take away your humanness that places you, that you have in common with everyone else in the community that you live in, and exceptionalizes you. And you also, while it's important to resist that on its own terms, we can't conduct all of our politics in that way because we're still to a level buying. The ideal would be to change the conversation, talk about something different, unifying ideals, principles, things that we can all agree on that affect everyone around us and not just us. And I don't mean as a performance of being a good person, because there's this idea that if you prove you're good enough or a net plus to society, it won't be Islamophobic anymore. That's not the idea. The idea is to just allow those principles to guide you to build a strong enough coalition with just the people around you so that you support them in what they need and they support you, because ultimately your needs are the same.
The point that you brought up about Muslimness as an identity is rare, because I think what a lot of people miss in conversations around Muslims and community engagement, political engagement, is that we can conduct ourselves in a very Islamic way without focusing on the Muslim identity side of things. And I understand where the emotional roots of that Muslim identity bit comes from, because we have been in such a survival mode for so long that we created, as you said, this culture of Muslimness and Muslim identity and how we present as Muslim, both as a reaction to Islamophobia and othering and racism and all those things. And in some ways almost performs a protective measure for us, right?
Yeah.
Yes, we know that we are other and we're different, and we're going to hold on to that as a part of, by extension, holding on to our faith itself. For a lot of people, it plays that role. But when we talk about political engagement and community engagement, we lose sight of what it means to have an Islamic ethical framework and
Mhm.
how to operate based off of that framework in issues that don't just impact us at a physical or emotional level that most people end up only paying attention to, which is like at the physical level, we're talking about Islamophobia, right? The surveillance state, we're talking about assaults, violent crime, hate crimes, all that kind of stuff, right? Obviously, people are going to pay attention to that because it literally impacts our everyday lives. And then you have the emotional triggers, which are like sex education, the LGBTQ agenda, stuff like that, almost exclusively that actually, where abortion as an extension of that, where people will get very emotionally triggered and pile onto this discussion, coming more so from, again, a Muslim identity perspective than an Islamic ethical framework perspective, which I saw
Mhm.
a lot with abortion discussions. But we forget about the fact that living in society and being in politics, being engaged not just at the state or federal system, which is where Muslims pay a lot of attention to, starting literally from the ground up. And that doesn't mean politics in the sense of election to an office. It means literally engaging with your community at the most basic level. So we're talking about parent advisory committees and school boards, right? Like we talk about this only in the sense of, oh, we need to tell the school boards that we don't support LGBTQ materials and whatever in our classrooms. Okay, but where were you when the discussion was about kids showing up to school hungry because they come from food insecure households and the school is no longer providing lunches for these kids? And where
Mm.
were we as part of that discussion when we should have been at the forefront of it and we should have been like, hey, it is our Islamic moral drive to ensure that our neighbors are taken care of and these children are part of our neighbors. So what can we as a community contribute to this and advocate for funding for feeding these kids? How can we create mutual aid funding to provide food to these kids? How can we be part of endeavors to address food insecurity for these kids in school or supporting teachers so that if they're striking for better pay and better work conditions, how can we support them in that context? Usually we're only thinking about, oh, I have to pay more taxes. Oh, I have to donate again to the school. Don't I? Isn't it supposed to be a public school? Or, oh, why do these teachers want to get paid so much? It's a very selfish
Yeah.
perspective instead of an Islamic ethical framework of what are our moral obligations as Muslims to the entire society around us. Again, starting from something as small, quote unquote small, as your child's school, right? Or other things that, again, they all impact us. Housing crisis. There's so many Muslims in many different regions and in cities in the West that are impacted by the housing crisis. And unfortunately, we do have a demographic of Muslims who are in the upper middle class, who are part of the 1%, who are actually part of the problem because they're slumlords. They're terrible landlords who are exacerbating the housing crisis. Where are our community discussions around the ethics of that?
Yeah.
Around discussions around mortgages and riba and things like that, and how that's all contributing to something like the housing crisis. I'm talking about healthcare. Again, like you have a very like you mentioned the class divisions, and I would say that's, like, very prominent when we're talking about Arab and Desi communities in contrast to, like, literally the rest of the ethnically diverse Muslim community in the West, and a certain group that is very anti-taxes, that has a lot of condescension towards the lower class, ignoring or just not caring about the fact that a lot of the working class and those who are suffering from the consequences of poverty are Muslims. And if you are a financially secure Muslim, you have a moral ethical obligation to care about those who are less well off than you are and to fulfill communal responsibility, not just donations to the masjid for a new chandelier or a new carpet or whatever. I
Yeah.
find that this goes back to that idea of what is our Islamic ethical framework? Have we even inculcated within our communities this sense of, hey, being Muslim isn't just the performance of the cultural identity. It's not just these token donations to the masjid. It's not the popular causes that we talk about and engage in, but it's so much more expansive than that. And all of that, once we start getting involved in those causes, once we start being consistent in demonstrating that ethical, moral framework, that's going to lead medically to having more influence at your community level and will build up to influence at higher levels as well.
Yeah. No, even thinking about some of the examples you used. So some of the most draconian protest laws that were passed in the UK were passed. Environmental protests were going on. So Extinction Rebellion had their protests, and guaranteed some people might not agree with their tactics, but that was the focus at the time. And the government obviously they took the opportunity really to react and pass these crazy protest laws that have affected Muslims in particular later on when it came to the protests against genocide. And the question goes back to, where were we when it came to being concerned about the environment? Where were we when this was happening? Because there is a level of selectiveness, and it is to do with what we've based this identity around. And I'll come to that in a second, but this is just an example. And then wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is such an astounding injustice that we're looking at today. I was listening to something that said that the difference in income or in wealth between someone on minimum wage in the UK and a billionaire is 150 times more than the difference between a peasant and the king during
Wow.
feudalism. And so it's such a massive inequality, and it's astonishing. And when we think it's also the core issue that brings together everything that we're fighting, because if you think about it, the attempts to accumulate more capital reason behind colon as an imperial outpost in the Middle East in the first place. So it's part of the entire system. But just thinking about that and focusing on how to deal with that and how to tackle that, because it affects everyone every day. And it's like you mentioned, like people, losing their homes, not being able to pay for their home, losing out on these mortgages. When someone is no longer able to pay a mortgage and loses their home, it doesn't just disappear off the face of earth. Someone takes it, someone acquires it. And that's essentially the process of the poor losing their wealth to the rich. And it's a continuous process that keeps happening and keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And that process of loss is replicated in so many different ways across the board. And these are things that Muslims principally should be concerned by and should be at the forefront of advocating for, just on the basis of what our principles are. It's almost as though we expect Islam to give us like a blueprint for every single moral value we should hold. That's not how it works. Not necessarily a blueprint. Sorry, you should care about this and this.
It's
It's
how
that,
you care about it. That's the other thing. People think that it's always gonna be a very cut and dry answer, and I think it's a way of absolving ourselves of being proactive and being critical thinkers and actually being engaged in society.
yeah, I think, yeah, because you have a blueprint, but also you're a person. A lot of the political deliberations when it comes to Islam is, are you serving the overall good of community? It comes down to maslahah. And so a lot of those you can answer for yourself. You can use Islamic principles to guide you, and think about what is affecting, what is concerning your community the most, and how best you can serve them. On the production of Muslim identity, I've just been thinking about it, thinking of neoliberalism. So the idea that there was once a saying that the revolution will be televised, but now the idea is the revolution will be commodified. So it's that neoliberalism has the capacity to absorb any and every form of resistance to it, right? And turn it into a commodity. And so
Mhm.
that is why, despite this stark inequality, there is no revolution. You don't see any real challenge to power, even though if you think of theorists like Marx, they would have said that at this level, when people reach this level of poverty and society reaches this level of inequality and people are this disenfranchised, there is no choice but to revolt and to resist. But that's not happening. And I think Muslim identity is produced in that same way. So if you think of Islam as a system of resistance to this inequality that liberalism, capitalism, and modernity imposes, then the production of the Muslim identity is, in some senses, the commodifying of what it means to be Muslim. Because what it means is we engage, it softens it, it produces a palatable version that allows you to comfortably exist within capitalism specifically, because that's what it doesn't challenge at its very core. It doesn't challenge capitalism.
And it goes back to, I feel like, again, absolving Muslims of our responsibilities to critically engage and to be part of a process of resisting the injustice, resisting the zulm that is plaguing our entire world. And that, again, we have a moral imperative to fight against, but people don't want to. And I was thinking about this in the sense of discussions around like halal investments
Oh,
and stock market and things like that. And something that's always bothered me is I put aside the fiqh of like, what isn't a halal stock to invest in. But the very idea of the way stock markets operate, the way the entire structure there operates, is that inherently Islamic? Is that producing does it operate according to ethical principles? Is it producing ethical outcomes? And when you try to rubber stamp things as like, oh, these are like halal stock markets and whatever, there's a glossing over of those bigger questions and those deeper
yeah.
questions. And as you said, it's simply reproducing the same system in a way that makes us feel like, oh, okay, this is fine. And it doesn't ask ourselves, or it doesn't ask of us, what does it mean for something to be inherently Islamically ethical? And beyond a technical, is it permissible, is it not?
Yeah, talks about it. He's mastered the art of sticking the term Islamic before anything and therefore pretending that it is Islamic. And it's, again, it's the production of the culture of Muslimness. And some people might say that we see the need to create wealth in Muslim communities. But where is that going? Because we don't have a circular economy. So that wealth is just in the same way as in any other community, it's just being accumulated at the very top. And Muslims, I mean, at least in the UK, the majority of Muslims live in poverty and deprivation and aren't able to speak to themselves and aren't able to, they don't even have the basic conditions for human flourishing. And it's only going to get worse because we're looking at economic crisis after another. Is this idea that you can make something technically okay, stick Islamic before it, and it just becomes part of this accepted culture, and we don't really question the systems that we're playing into. But also posing it as a solution. I've seen many people talk about investment and so on as a solution for the problem of poverty and deprivation for Muslims. It's a bit American dreamy in a way of if you work hard enough, you're going
It's
it's a,
prosperity gospel.
essentially, and it's not worked for such a long time, and it holds back Muslims who are working class from having this consciousness amongst themselves. And that's also something that's missing. They're not necessarily conscious of the unique struggles that they face and how different that is from this production of culture and what is actually accessible to them. Someone with absolutely no assets whatsoever, like they own nothing but the clothes on their back, investment and halal investment and all of that is just, it's gibberish to them. It's not really a solution. There needs to be something broader. And that thing that is broader, actually, it would serve all of society. It would serve everyone who is not wealthy and disenfranchised. And it's those terms that we should be thinking about. Someone suggested moving away from even universal values and thinking about just basic human the needs you need for human flourishing. So what does every single person need? Everyone needs a home, everyone needs a house to live in, to keep them in. Everyone needs warmth, everyone needs food. These are the basic conditions for human flourishing, and we all agree on them. There is no disagreement because they're not even ideological. So if we start there and start thinking about what are the barriers to human beings being able to achieve this, even though there is so much wealth in the wealth exists, people just don't have it. If we start questioning systems in that way, I think we'll come to a much bigger understanding of what is happening to us and what is happening in the world and start to that actually come together to oppress all of us.
Yes, exactly. And once we start not just questioning the systems, but then starting even at the micro level combating those systems and opting out of them, not in a passive way, but in an active way. So I'm thinking about, I think it was in Minnesota where the Somali community has like an amazing example of not engaging with banks at all for mortgages and loans, but using like a traditional way of like wealth sharing, I guess you could say. Not even wealth sharing, but borrowing
Mhm.
practices. I forget what you would call it in English. I think they call it in Arabic, like the jam'iyya, where everybody like pools together their like a certain amount of wealth a month. I don't know. Every person in like a group of 50 puts in $5, $10, and everybody takes turns being able to that total amount. And
Yeah.
In Minnesota, the Somali community used this method to be able to support purchasing houses completely riba free, completely mortgage free, and purchasing cars and like major purchases that people put themselves into debt for. They were
Mhm.
able to utilize this alternate, very finance and
Yeah.
of financial engagement to be able to access these life-changing, wealth-producing items, these commodities, in a way that, like I said, did not engage with the secular banks at all. And they were able to support each other, and they were by tapping into this collective mindset, by tapping into these strategies, they were able to flourish financially as a community that in a way that they would never have been able to if they just bought into the regular ideas of I'm just going to take a loan and I'll pay interest and then I'm going to be mired in this debt for so many years, but at least I have the thing. Whereas with
Yeah.
this model, yeah, it might have taken them a little bit longer to access the thing immediately, but when they did, they're completely debt free. And then other people are able to benefit in the same way. And it's a type of mutual aid and support. And if you imagine this being scaled up to not just like one community, but many communities, right? People not engaging with the banking system for mortgages and loans, just as one example of many, to see that even non-Muslims are going to catch on to that and be like, hang on, this is amazing.
Yeah.
This is, like, impacting my life in such a positive way, and that like, by creating our own holistic, proactive narratives and alternatives, and they have to be practical, it can't just be at the level of theory, it has to be what are the tangible outcomes that we are seeing. So going back to this example of the Somali community in Minnesota and the way that they're purchasing houses and cars, going back to schools and making sure that kids are no longer spending the day hungry, right? Going back to supporting teachers, you are automatically going to start seeing these very real changes, and the people who are positively impacted by those changes are going to be like, wow, who are those who are driving this change? I really relate to this. I appreciate this. I want to be a part of this. People will want to turn towards these Islamic alternatives that are being offered, and you don't have to label it as Islamic from the get go, but as people find out about it, become invested in it, want to be a part of it, you can show that, yeah, all of this comes from an Islamic framework. It makes me think to a certain extent that simply by virtue of Mamdani's Muslimness being known, people started
Mhm.
looking into Islam itself. And I like saw social media reels and things where people were like, wow, really love his platform for free public transit and lowering the rents, whatever. And he's Muslim. Is there some connection here? And then they went and started reading about zakat and awqaf. And they're like, wow, there's an entire like religious framework that supports all these policies that he's advocating for. Not to say that he made that connection himself or associated it himself, but
Mhm.
people came to that conclusion. And it's not an incorrect conclusion either, right? When you see that the frameworks and the offerings that our tradition already has that exists as very real practical options. Like people are going to see that and they're going to want it and they're going to want more of it and they're going to want to support that. And that leads to us being able to build a sense of community integrity, right? We're demonstrating that we are a viable, moral, productive option. We're not just talking a big game, we're putting that into action. We're walking the walk, we're being consistent about it. And from there, we go into the phase of being able to build coalitions from a place of strength and not a place of defensiveness and weakness where we're always trying to defend our identity, but we're able to point to very real, specific human problem and say, this is how we're going to solve it. And let's do the work for it. And now we are working towards solving this.
Yeah, we wouldn't even need to point to it. No, it's one of those things where I also agree. It doesn't need to be stated explicitly. You don't need to label something Islamic. You just need to do it because once something is done, the impact of it can be felt. Most recently, I was speaking to the CEO of one of the charities here in the UK, and he was saying that they're only now realizing how much food insecurity impacts people in the UK. They just wasn't aware of the level to which people just weren't sure when their next meal was going to be and how much they relied. Kids relied on school meals, not sure if they could have meals at home, and how actually different a variety of ideological actors would use that to lure people in because people need food and they're willing to go to where it is. And it can be used in a number of horrible ways. And so imagine providing that, making sure that people aren't insecure, making people sure that people's dignity is preserved when they're seeking food. You don't need to name it, you don't need to label it Islamic. People will recognize that value for what it is. And what you're also doing is you're making sure you're not alone because what's happening is with the rise of fascism, there needs to be a scapegoat. There's huge strife here in Europe and the US as well. There's a impending economic crash that's going to affect everyone, and it's only going to get worse scapegoat. And we don't want to be left standing alone. And we want to have people to give people a reason to want to defend us because otherwise, you can talk about diversity and the value of diversity and stuff, but essentially you're grounding your reason for being here and for existence and the reason you're giving people to defend you are grounded in an ideology that is not your own. You're essentially quoting liberal ideals back at them and saying, you said this first, come in and defend it when it's a dying ideology anyway. Whereas real tangible change, things that contribute even in the tiniest way in communities, but it's also to politicize it. Think of it as a political act, an act of building, because that's exactly what it is. Communities that are successful in organize at that level first. If you think of examples of some of the most resilient communities we've seen, like Gaza, a lot of people are like, and I don't want to dehumanize people by calling them overly resilient and stuff. People suffered immensely beyond what any human should ever have to see, and nothing makes that okay. Nothing makes that acceptable. And exceptionalizing people in that way almost makes it seem like brutality towards them is less severe when it's not. What I'm saying is the communities did display a massive level of resilience, and that didn't come from nowhere. People aren't just that able to share resources, to strategize ways to clean water without having been organized before. It was an organized community that was very well aware of the danger it was facing and the possibilities that could manifest into something really horrible. I'm sure no one imagined the scale to which it would be horrible. But that being aware of that and working with each other for a very long time, everyone knowing each other, everyone building together and in a communal manner meant that they had the best chances of survival as a community together, despite the brutality that they faced. In that sense, we can think of grassroots communal organizing as the basic start point of any form of resistance that we want to create.
I think too what's really important to point out, as you said, with the example of the people of Gaza, like they had an idea of what they were struggling and they had a vision of what it is they're working towards, what they're building towards, right? It's not just survival at its basis level, it's survival with a higher imperative in mind. So whether that, like we see that, for example, in the children who continued to memorize it, like into Hifz in the middle of a genocide. We see that with medical students who weren't just, oh no, the Zionists like bombed my university, nothing I can do. They continued their training and they continued practicing as much as they could during the genocide. They are actively, constantly looking towards a vision of what does it look like for us to grow and thrive as a people, even as we are being actively destroyed. And I think that what we see in Western Muslim communities is we've been in a very scattered survival mode. There hasn't been a sense of what is our vision here. Even as Muslims are talking about political engagement at the state level, at the federal level, it's always like buying into the existing system, vaguely hoping that we'll be able to do something about Islamophobia, vaguely hoping that, oh, if we have somebody in power, it's going to help us. But there's nothing truly concrete behind it. There isn't a meaningful vision or central goal in mind to direct everybody's efforts in various diverse ways towards that. And if we're only thinking about it in terms of, oh, we're going to have some kind of political power to just be left alone, I don't think that is a viable strategy. I don't even think that is a healthy strategy to have. As Muslims, again, we have so many moral imperatives, namely, like, we're given the broad spectrum of you're created to worship Allah. What does that look like in the real world? That means that we believe in an akhirah. That means we believe in being held accountable on the day of judgment. That means that accountability is coupled with significant responsibility, not towards ourselves as individuals and at the nuclear family level, but at a wider societal spectrum. And this is how we have so many hadith that talk about the person who mingles amongst the people and endures their harm is superior to the one who is like up in a mountain just worshiping constantly. We
Yeah.
have lost a holistic sense of what it means to be an ummah and to have a vision that we should be working towards. What are your thoughts on how we can better create and articulate the a better vision or an actually coherent vision that we could start, not like obviously with ourselves as individuals and then at our family levels and then at our immediate community level, whether that's the masjid or your neighborhood or whatever. Any thoughts on that?
So I think you're right. As in, as humans, we're not actually created to think about only survival. Survival is a basic instinct for every single created thing, including animals. What makes us different as humans is the ability to think beyond that, to innovate. It's what distinguishes us. So if you think of hunting for survival or trying to gather food for survival, all animals have that instinct and have that need, but the ability to create tools and to be creative in the manner by which we go about it is what makes us human. It's the innovation. It's going beyond just existing and just surviving to creating something. And that's what we need to start to want to envision. It's the creation of something. Mamdani, his campaign, going back to that because it's the talk of the town, it gave people hope in a time where there isn't much hope. And it's very simple things, right? You can afford to live where you live. That was the core of it. You can live with dignity. You can continue to exist here. You can live in your homes. You can rent your homes without fearing an increase and things like that. People are starting to really need, I think there is several things that need to interact with each other here. One, there is an argument to be made for knowledge building, right? And creating institutions that build knowledge and imagining what a better future for us, wherever we are, would look like. There needs to be investment in those ideas, in that imagination, because in the immediate term, things will play out how they are going to play out. I'm not saying we shouldn't attempt to resist what is happening, but they will play out how they will. And we could see a rise of fascism in the West for a while, but that will fall. And the question comes back to, and what do we have ready for what comes after? What have we prepared for that? And I think we can start really small, thinking about what would make our communities better, the immediate community we're around, what would make our mosques function better. If we think of everything Muslims build or everything that creates Muslim community as a pillar of Islamic civilization. So mosques are seeds because as soon as you have a mosque, you have a community coming and congregating around it. And that's a beautiful thing. You have Jama'ah, you have a madrasa, you have 5 daily prayers, you have a place where people come and talk about what they need. You have people coming in to see an imam and talk to him about the issues that they face. And that's a pillar of civilization. So if we start thinking of every space that we create as a pillar of the civilization we're trying to build, and think of the ideal civilization template that we had, that was Medina, and how that was built, right? It started with the seed, that was the mosque, and then it was people going and staying with their neighbors, and it was creating that sense of brotherhood and neighborhood with people. So it's starting really small and basic with things that you might miss when thinking about the bigger picture, but really are the foundation of what we're trying to create. And ultimately, that is what we're aiming for as a vision. What exactly it would look like, but it's the flourishing Islamic civilization, not in an identity sense, but in the true sense of what it's supposed to represent and what it's supposed to create and do to humanity.
That's really comprehensive, and I think that really covers a lot of what I was hoping that we would get to with this podcast and with this discussion, because I'm never happy with just that theoretical aspect of the discussion, which is definitely important, but that theory always has to translate into reality, and I think you've done a really great job of kind of directing towards that and pointing out how the theory that we were discussing boils down to real action that starts within, as you said, every masjid as a pillar of an Islamic society and civilization that we can make strong and we can make real, but we have to share that vision, we have to share that perspective, and we have to share that sense of communal responsibility. So I'm really hoping that those who listen to this podcast are inspired to look at their own families and to go to their local masjid, or if they're in a place without a masjid, get together with other families, Muslim and non-Muslim, and be like, okay, what can we do right now to help our community right now? How can we help this neighborhood? How can we help this school? How can we help this town? And figure out where people's strengths lie and where these strengths can be pooled into a long-term consistent effort that again creates something that is meaningful and impactful and long-term, and not something that will be forgotten after a few months or a few years, but become its own thing and establish a new positive proactive norm. Because getting all that together and building up on those lines is going to create about a Muslim political agenda. It's going to create Islamic framework for existing that everybody benefits from.
And hopefully everyone will see the beauty of it. And that's how hopefully we get to the flourishing of Islamic civilization, inshallah. Thank you very much for having me.
Khair for spending time with us on this podcast. And to our listeners, as always, share your thoughts, share this podcast, and make dua for us all, and let us all be committed to this communal goal of community building and world changing, inshallah.
Hey everyone, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle Muslim Matters. And check out our site daily at muslimmatters.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.